For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Nitin Gokhale. Last week, the sinking of a Russian missile cruiser, Moskva, has sent not only shockwaves amongst military strategists or even enthusiasts, but also shown the Russian military in poor light. Now, why has this happened? How has this happened? And is it now showing up the Russian military's poor preparedness or mishandling of the situation in Ukraine? Are all the questions that are being raised across the world. Today, to talk about this incident in particular, and of course, in general, about the military strategy or the naval strategy and tactics, I'm joined by Rear Admiral Sudharshan Shrikhande, a well-known guest on StratNews Global as well as on my other website, bharatshakti.in, and a specialist in many of the tactics and strategies in naval warfare, as well as keeping a watch on strategic issues across the world. Welcome to this program, Admiral Shrikhande. It's a shocking incident in many ways, right?
Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed, it is a surprising incident at one level that it happened. But I would say that at a fundamental level, such surprises have happened for a long, long time. Indeed, this is not the first, nor the second, nor the third such incident. In fact, there have been probably dozens of incidents like this, where tactically people have been surprised, and perhaps tactically, a particular navy has been underprepared, if not unprepared.
So in this case, because this was a flagship of the Russian fleet in Black Sea, would the Ukrainians have been searching for it or targeting it particularly, or do you think it's one of those lucky hits with the so-called Neptune missile is what everybody is talking about? What is your preliminary assessment based on whatever is available in public domain?
At this stage, it is probably very difficult to unravel what happened because both sides have been guarded in what I think they have put out. There is also an element of sort of fake news that has been coming about a lot of aspects about this. So I would say that from what is reasonably known at this stage, is that the ship was attacked. It was probably attacked by anti-ship missiles, probably the Neptune. We do not know what all tactics the Ukrainian used, but as you mentioned, it seems certain that they have been tracking these ships, this fleet off the coast of Ukraine in the Black Sea and in the Black Sea as a whole. Certainly, the one thing that happens today with regularity is that in peacetime or with other partners, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance (ISR), as we say, is something that nations can help other nations and yet not get complicitly involved. So we do not know what sort of assistance the Ukrainians had, but one imagines, that they had this assistance. And finally, to attack an adversary, you have to know where the adversary is and then figure out how best to do it. So I agree with you that the Ukrainians must have been tracking these ships. I mean, they were not operating very far from coastlines. The Black Sea is quite big, but in terms of ISR capabilities that can be brought in, it could the space could be relatively shrunk for higher intensity and persistence of watching where the ships are. That apart, I guess it is one hears from the media that the Ukrainians might have used drones, etc., to keep both the enemy under pressure and created a factor of surprise and distraction. I mean, you look at the principles of war from Chanakya to Sun Tzu to the modern principles of war, where, to use a more current term, surprise and security as principles of war remain absolutely relevant. So they might have used tactics to deceive Russian ships operating off the Ukrainian and the Black Sea coast, and lull them into a certain level of complacency, perhaps. On the other hand, from the Russian side also, initially there was denial. After that, there was an acceptance that, there was a fire, there was some damage, whether it was action damage or an internal explosion, was still quite hazy. And only I think yesterday they finally announced that the ship had sunk while proceeding to its base port in en route. So there could have been various factors. There is a small possibility that it could have been added by an underwater explosion that could have come from a torpedo or more likely from drifting mines. There have been reports of fishermen having, recovered drifting mines in their nets, including some Turkish fishermen. So who has let these mines drift along, which is of course not permitted under international law? We do not know, but it seems to me that as the war is intensifying, uh, uh, both sides will probably use greater and greater uh, tactical flexibility and surprise. But that said, uh, uh, it probably is an embarrassment for the
It
Russian
is.
Navy
It
to have
shows
to have
some
lost
degree.
lost a flagship like this, and it shows a certain level, as you mentioned, of perhaps lack of competence.
Absolutely. In fact, Sudarshan, as you know, we are working on, and for our viewers' benefit, we are working on an article about analyzing the Russia-Ukraine conflict from its different aspects. In fact, the entire spectrum. And one of the things that one also is going to talk about in that article is about what is the new, if you can say, a predominant trend is capturing perceptions, is the new high ground of war and conflict these days. So we really don't know. There is a lot of fog of war here. Could the ship been hit by, say, a underwater explosion? Maybe a torpedo had hit the ship and not really the Neptune missile. All those speculations are going on in OSINT handles on Twitter and in other social media platforms. So there could be several possibilities, right? But the fact is, the Russian ship has sunk, which is a major embarrassment, as you mentioned.
Yes, of course. I would say, you mentioned about a lucky shot, uh, and that's quite possible. If we go by sort of how many missiles are required to sink a ship, then the numbers could be larger in terms of single shot. I'm just going here into a little naval technicality or a weapons technicality of
Please
single
do.
shot kill probability. But
Please do.
history is replete with examples of the lucky shot, whether it was HMS Hood in the battle against Bismarck, whether it were two of the battle cruisers in the Battle of Jutland, um, whether it was one single torpedo that hit the Belgrano, or sometimes it has taken more shots. I mean, one example where a relatively smaller destroyer, the Israeli destroyer Eilat, which sank actually 3 months after the Six-Day War. There is a
Hmm.
misperception that
In
she was sunk
67,
during the Six-Day War in
in
1967. That's right.
1967. That's right.
That's right. In 1967. So this happened at a time of sort of what I think the in Arabs and Israelis termed it as the war of attrition, which was after the 1967 Six-Day War, where a fair amount of skirmishes took place. And I think the Egyptians were extremely skillful in in creating deception, and from their missile boats launched three, if I remember right, three of the earliest class of anti-ship missiles that they had. And mind you, when we are talking about 1967, so our own induction of missile boats was still a few years into the future for
In
1971,
71.
and
Yeah.
that has been mentioned. So uh, it took that time. If I remember right, and pardon me if I am wrong, uh, it took, I think, three missile hits to sink Eilat, because they all sort of hit on the upper deck. But a lucky shot, with two missiles hitting or one smaller missile hitting, if it hits ammunition that has been primed and fused and kept ready for action on the upper decks, can set off secondary explosions. It can set
That's
off
right.
secondary fires, and it can create underwater damage that can create hull breaches and result in sinking. So there are several possibilities. Uh, rather than speculating that it was this weapon or that weapon. It shows us the complexity of
Naval war.
naval combat at the tactical level, and therefore the degree of readiness, uh, attention, and alertness that is required 24/7 to avoid that 5 minutes of misery that can befall one's own ship, from which there might not be recovery. So
Absolutely.
naval warfare is a lot of inaction and then suddenly a few minutes of mayhem and action.
Exactly. In fact, the Russians have somewhat indirectly admitted that there was an explosion in the ammunition storage, which again, confirms the possibility that you mentioned that it could have been hit. The ammunition would have been ready on the upper deck also, or there could have been a lucky hit in the ammunition storage, several decks below, perhaps. So we don't know really. But the other thing that I wanted to bring in and seek your comments on is the Russian military's recent trend of being a showcase military, rather than being completely competent and very well trained military. The parades and the starched uniforms and the grand display for which the communist countries erstwhile or otherwise are known. Would that have played some part in the incompetence that is now very evident in this incident from on the Russian part?
I mean, that's always an interesting issue to think about. It could well be so. It could well be a contributor to a general sense of false assurance or bravado that 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 such issues bring up. I as a you've covered as a journalist, and as a book writer and as a historian of recent conflicts in some countries, what happens at the tactical level. And therefore, I mean, when I as a young officer was in the Soviet Union, under a very sort of communist environment, uh, initially I was also impressed with all the flags and all the parades that one could see live. uh, and yet you realize that after some time, your mind stopped noticing those big slogans, big flags, etc., because they were always there. And your mind sort of shut them out as white noise. And I'm sure this happened to Russian citizens, or Soviet citizens at that time, to a greater extent. But so there is this danger, I would say, of putting it somewhere, that when symbolism overwhelms or trumps substance, uh, it is a problem. And I feel that especially in the last 10 years, uh, as a sort of detached anecdotal observer, of film clips of their parades, the increasingly complex band concerts, and commemorative events that have increased over time. uh, the drill has become more complex. The parades have become larger. Not only that, parades have been held in various cities, and various events are being commemorated. Now, of course, all armed forces do some parades. They are probably an important part of the civil military relationship, where the civilian population needs to see some of this. But there's always a danger of this being overdone. I would say that it was those very impressive sort of May Day parades and post World War II parades that used to come on newsreels, which impressed a lot of countries. And therefore, uh, even our parade sort of got patterned, perhaps on that, thinking this was one way of bringing the military might of a country, to the notice of millions and crores of citizens. But there could be a downside to it, because all such ceremonial events also come at a opportunity cost of the effort, time, and monies that are involved in that. And finally, I mean, I would say, and I think we've discussed this separately while talking about it, that uh, the only really the only place an armed forces have to perform is on the battlefield.
Battlefield,
Uh,
yeah, absolutely.
every other performance is much lower in priority. So this is where we need to be careful. And to that extent, we could probably look at uh, some of the militaries, uh, especially in, say, Western countries, which do a lot lesser of all this. Um, and I think maybe 2 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, I'm not very sure, but there was political driving going on in Washington for impressive parades, to which, if I remember right, the Pentagon was not at all keen to do that,
Right.
and they finally, did it in a very small measure, because all
Correct.
this comes at an opportunity cost. Uh, I'm not saying do away with all this. Some of it is required for the civil military understanding, but there's a danger in any country of doing this. Democracies have a mechanism by which some of these things get toned down, but in autocracies, uh,
Yes.
directives can go, which is what I believe could be happening in Russia. I'm not entirely sure whether this is a major contributory factor. That is difficult to say,
Yeah.
because
But it is
you
one of
can't.
it could be influenced, could have influenced one of those things. The other thing which was noticed by people who watch naval incidents and naval accidents or naval sinkings is the predictable pattern under which the ship was patrolling. It
Yeah.
wasn't, in the Black Sea. So it became perhaps easy target. It became easier for the Ukrainians and their allies to pinpoint with some accuracy where the ship was and then target it. Again, it shows either the lack of initiative or innovation in the Russian military or the navy, and also laxness or laxity on part of the skipper of the ship itself, without being too judgmental. What would you think of these some of these opinions that have been given out in public domain?
Yeah, yeah, I think there could be a lot going on for these opinions, that your again, deception, surprise, concentration of force, economy of effort, all have to be evaluated as things happen. There were signs, of course, that the Ukrainians had probably developed this missile some years back. Ukraine, after all, had a fair amount of defense technology base that they had. I mean, it's also there are analyses which show that the Ukrainian armed forces performance in 2014 or 18 was also not up to scratch in many ways. But they seem
Right.
to have learned lessons. They've
Hmm.
done badly there. The Russian, um, or the separatists in those Russian controlled areas or Russian
Yes.
influenced areas in Donbass, etc., also did quite well. So the picture is not one sided. That one side is showing all the skills and the other side is conspicuous by the uh, the proof of lack of skills, as sort of, if one could put it that way. But I would say that here, the predictability had to be decreased. They were operating far too close, and I just go back to uh, um, a line that has been, I think, wrongly attributed to Admiral Nelson, who cautioned that that a ship cannot fight a fort. Uh, Now, in 200 years ago, it was true, because
The range.
castles had
Hmm.
had much bigger guns than had ships, and ships' guns could not be elevated to
Right.
attack, especially guns that were fitted on castles, which were fitted on higher ground, perhaps
Right.
forts, etc., on a hill.
Correct.
So, but nonetheless, what has happened in naval warfare are, I would say, two major trends. One is that there is a persistence of knowing where your adversary is likely to be. This clarity is not 100%, but it is far better than we can imagine, and it can be supplemented through space-based surveillance, through greater cyber operations, through greater electronic means, and of course through surveillance by maritime patrol aircraft, by drones, by high altitude drones, by the smaller drones, like the Turkish drones that Ukraine seems to be using. So there are a whole lot of uh, uh, options
Vectors.
available for greater battlefield transparency. There
That's
will be gaps in that transparency that can be exploited, but you can never be sure whether you are being watched or you are in a gap during that watch. So if you are operating in a small area going up and down, uh, you will sooner or later, the probability that you will be hit will keep increasing with time. And I
your
think the
footprints
Russians
are
could have,
also. Yeah, your footprints are much more visible
That's right.
and are
That's
predictable to map,
yes,
really.
yes. And really, I would say that, having operated without sort of major incident now for 3-4 weeks, uh, there might have been, as you said, some laxity uh, coming into the minds of a ship's crew itself.
That's right.
That the danger is not so real, uh,
Hmm.
and it is not so immediate. So there could be various factors. This only time will tell, or perhaps time will never tell. But
Never tell. We
but
don't know.
but there are lessons for every navy and every armed force here.
I was going to come to that. Let's broaden the discussion a little bit. Let us look at how the Chinese Navy, which is being talked about the world over, how it is rapidly ramping up its assets, its capabilities, how it is now coming increasingly going sort of has longer legs than before. I'm sure the Chinese are, like all other militaries, are watching what's happening in Ukraine or in Black Sea in purely in naval terms. How would you think they would assess this? Because they also have what they call carrier killers, ships, anti-ship missiles, and they would really be salivating at this prospect if it is true that the Neptune has, sort of sunk the Russian flagship in Black Sea.
Yes, I mean, the fact that ordnance like anti-ship missiles can sink ships is now well known since 1967 at least, and
Yes.
several incidents after that, including merchant ships that were attacked by during the so-called tanker war between 1980 and 1988. So all
Hmm.
this is par for the course. It will continue. What is happening is the types of ordnance are changing. The lethality of the lethality of ordnance is changing because the accuracy of ordnance is improving. Uh, a lot of I've read some comments that it's only a 140 kilo warhead or it's a 200 kilo warhead, but it
Yes.
depends on where the 200 kilo or 140 kilo warhead strikes. So it's just like a 5.56 bullet can do similar damage that a 7.62 caliber bullet can also
Exactly.
do, depending
True.
on where one or the other hits. So
Yes.
it's not a linear aspect like that. So certainly precision, lethality, speed, and accuracy are increasing in weapons. And you mentioned, the so-called carrier killers, which is actually a range of a more accurate ordnance that the Chinese are building, and other countries are also embarking on that. Uh, so it is to call it a carrier killer, of course, is a more catchy term, but it could equally strike larger ships of 8,000, 10,000 tons, or amphibious assault ships, or large merchant ships. uh,
Yes.
uh, the missile warhead doesn't really care, uh, so long as it homes on. So there is this danger now, or there is a greater need to develop greater defensive capabilities, greater tactical uh, uh,
Agility.
measures, which agility of the mind actually. So it would go back to what I sort of one of my favorites is what John Boyd said, that what matters is people, ideas, and things. So people and he said also that in that order. So things are the hardware we have, the hardware we will develop, but people and ideas, how we measure them, like you were mentioning, did they fall short tactically? So tactically you can fall short because of hardware, you can fall short about because of people whose training may not be up to scratch, and ideas that help all put all these things together. So
Sure.
I would say that specifically in the case of China, China would be learning those lessons, as should everybody else. Uh, and I would say that one of the things that sort of strikes me is that the Russians seem to have performed poorly at all levels, across all dimensions. The strategic level of warfare, the operational level of warfare, and the tactical level of warfare. And you mentioned some time back, the war of perception, and that's a very important point that you made, because even the war of perceptions, Ukraine seems to be managing much better. Of course, one of the problems is these days, you know, uh, uh, one just doesn't know what is fake and what is not fake. To that extent, it has happened. There is some now increasing clarity, but this creates its own problems, because how do you make your own people believe anything at all? So
Yeah.
there has to be some clarity, but internally for the armed forces, I mean, the armed forces cannot live on fake news. Neither can armed forces, plan their next operation based on anything but real time assessment of intelligence of the enemy. And here a larger point I would like to sort of think about. I don't know whether there have been issues of cognitive biases about the enemy. What if one side feels, oh, the leader of the other side is quite literally a joker
Right.
because he was a comedian. Now,
Yes.
such cognitive biases can be very dangerous, of underestimating the enemy or
Yeah.
typecasting the enemy, as somebody inherently incapable of fighting or inherently incapable of bravery or, even tactical wisdom. So uh, the weak often win. Uh,
Yeah.
that's been
Yes.
that's been one
They
of
have
the
more
inferences
determination.
we talk from
They have
warfare.
more determination. Yeah, they have more determination. But that apart, just two final thoughts on this. One is, of course, the U.S. Has the largest naval forces in history. How would U.S. look at all this? Because their contest in the Pacific against the Chinese is based on their naval might. So, what would US be looking at? I mean, would they be looking at honing their tactics or tweaking their tactics on sea, or they would be looking at the Chinese developments? How would they react to this?
Again, I would say that uh, the Ukraine war or no war, even if this had not happened, even if Slava had not been attacked by missiles or sunk, I would say that in the United States, a whole lot of thinking is going on about precisely this problem, which they term, overcoming A2AD, Chinese A2AD, and they've been
Absolutely.
discussing this for years. There are
Correct.
of course, mixed inferences they are drawing. Part of the inferences come from, uh, the sort of the problems of admitting vulnerabilities of carriers,
Mhm.
because we get into a pro carrier versus anti carrier lobbies in the United States, but that's not a helpful start point for this. And I would say that much of the American discourse now, in fact now, for I would say for the past 3 or 4 years, has analyzed this as a very real threat, something that cannot be wished away because you love something about this, or that you cannot any longer afford to say no, carriers are not vulnerable, carriers are it, or something like that. Or it does not even mean that everything has to be replaced by submarines, but you have to create diverse capabilities and figure out. I mean, the challenges really are, how do you use the hardware you have better and better in the challenges that are coming up tomorrow and day after. You cannot wish your hardware away. You cannot create newer type of hardware overnight, and that's a challenge for even a larger navy, as you said. The U.S. as the U.S. Navy as the largest navy, but they are also looking at multi-dimensional warfare, where the Marines, Army, Space, and Cyber come together. And I think in this case, they are probably taking a leaf from the entire A2AD, which is multi-dimensional, as far as the Chinese have built. And I would say that the Chinese are uh, far advanced on the multi-dimensional operations. The Chinese would also, I think, one of the more important lessons that could be that all armed forces, not only that, political leadership should be thinking of, is how to create an environment where armed forces are under pressure to perform potentially in the conflict that is about to come or may come, and it can come with a suddenness. How do
Absolutely.
we prepare for that? And for that, I think they need the tools, they need the you know they need the authority to do what they need to do without pressures of distraction that can be created from outside the armed forces system. Uh, and and for even for political leadership of any country, whether democratic or authoritarian, uh, losing in a conflict is politically quite disadvantageous. In all this, I
Imprudent.
think finally I would like to just say that armed forces should never lose sight of the political objectives, but that also means that the political leadership should be able to formulate and convey the political objectives for which militaries have to perform at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels of warfare. Only then can something positive from that country's point of view. I'm not making a moral judgment on this. Uh,
True.
but positive, politically positive from that country's point of view, which might be disadvantageous or quite a tragedy for the loser.
Absolutely. No, but so that means, the prerequisite for all this between political leaders and military leaders is a clarity of communication and a very honest dialogue about what needs to be achieved. But one final question and a thought. In India, we have been again going through the debate that you mentioned about carrier or no carrier. And the late General Bipin Rawat was known as somebody who was a skeptic about obtaining or procuring a third aircraft carrier for Indian Navy. This should reignite again that debate, I suppose, which was put on the back burner. We are not sitting on judgment here, but there will be a lot of, I'm sure, analysis done in the Indian Naval Headquarters and navies around the world. So, your final thoughts on that before we close?
Yeah. Uh, I would say that we all have to learn lessons. Again, we don't need the Slava incident to point out what has been discussed for a long time. It has, nations need the armed forces that might perform better and better in future conditions. And some of that will have to come from how we use the past better. So India is, I think, in a good position. We have two carriers. Uh, Again,
Exactly.
any weapon system, any platform, any weapon system works that much the better. In when the opposition is that much the weaker. But what Slava shows and what all sort of wargaming shows, especially on the American side, is that a lot of ordnance can get through to say aircraft carriers. They've gamed it enough. But again, there are cultural challenges, what the Americans call tribal challenges of the carrier tribes versus the anti-carrier
Submarine.
tribe or something. But I don't think we need to get into an internecine warfare within any navy on this,
Yes.
or within any armed forces. We need a navy or an army or an air force that we need, not one, I would say, that we love or we are comfortable with. uh, so that is where we need to go. There's nothing romantic about war. There's nothing
No.
romantic about platforms. They are weapons of
Exactly.
war, and they
Yes.
they they ought to be made to perform what we have. And therefore, I think leadership and training and continuous combat training are required, and some of the other peripherals that navies and armies or air forces might be doing ought to be. We need to throttle back. All armed forces need to throttle back on this.
Very well put. I think as a final thought, let me end this conversation on this note. We don't know enough to analyze the incident of sinking of the Russian ship so far. I'm sure there will be occasion in the future, not too distant a future, on analyzing this. But certain early lessons from this incident in terms of tactics, in terms of the weapons platforms, and the effectiveness or even the luck one armed force or the other armed forces or the others need, whichever military is in combat. Thank you very much for your thoughts, Admiral Shrikhande. We will come back to you when we have an occasion, but this is precious, and I'm sure our viewers will really, benefit from your insights on naval tactics and naval strategies, and your thoughts on what may have gone wrong or what may have happened in the Black Sea. For the moment, it's thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. As always, a pleasure. Thank you, Nitin.
Thank you. So, viewers, as we always promise you, this is something that we specialize in. We try and bring you a different perspective each time. So, do keep watching StratNews Global. Do keep spreading the word for subscription to our YouTube channel. And of course, keep sending feedback and comments. We welcome them. We base our programs on many of these suggestions and comments that come in. But for the moment, it's goodbye from me, Nitin Gokhale.